The sun was setting over a quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows over the streets as the evening began. The air was warm, and the sounds of kids playing in their yards echoed across the block. Everything seemed normal, but for one police officer, his shift was about to take a turn that would change his life forever. Officer Davis had been patrolling the streets for years, working in the same neighborhood. He knew it like the back of his hand. But on this particular evening, things were different. He had his K-9 unit, Max, with him, a trained police dog who had always been by his side during tough situations. Max was known for being loyal and efficient, and Davis trusted him with his life. As they drove down a quiet street, Davis noticed someone jogging alone on the sidewalk. It was a woman, dressed in military-style athletic wear, running with steady determination. She had a presence about her, one that made Davis curious. He slowed down the car, but he didn't think much more of it. But Max, sitting in the back of the patrol car, was on alert. He was trained to notice everything and was always ready to act. Davis didn't think anything was wrong. He assumed the jogger was just a regular civilian out for a run. But Max suddenly began to bark loudly, his tail rigid, signaling that something was wrong. "Easy, boy," Davis muttered as he pulled over, unsure of what had triggered the dog's reaction. He reached into the back and grabbed Max's leash, stepping out of the car. The jogger, hearing the barking, turned to look at him. She looked calm, but something in her posture made Davis think she might be worried. The last thing he expected was for her to stop and make eye contact with him. But there she stood, facing him as Max barked even louder, his hackles raised. "Ma'am," Davis called out cautiously, "can I ask why you're out here?" The woman, who was breathing heavily from her run, looked at him. "I'm just out for my evening jog, officer. Is something wrong?" Davis hesitated for a moment, unsure why Max was behaving so strangely. "I don't know, ma'am. My dog seems to think otherwise." He tugged on Max's leash to get him to settle down, but the dog wasn't calming down. Instead, Max lunged forward, and in that moment, everything spiraled out of control. The jogger, caught off guard by Max's sudden movement, stumbled backward. But it was too late. Max had already reached her, and before Davis could react, the situation had escalated. The woman cried out, and Davis rushed forward, trying to pull Max back, but the dog wouldn't stop. Panicked, Davis shouted at the woman, "Hold still. I'm trying to get him off you." But it was too late. The dog had already caused harm. The jogger was on the ground, bleeding and struggling to move. Davis was in complete shock. He had never experienced anything like this before. The woman, who had once seemed so calm and confident, now lay there, her face twisted in pain. Davis looked at her, helpless, knowing that something had gone terribly wrong. His heart raced, and his hands trembled as he knelt beside her, trying to stop the bleeding. But it was no use. The situation had gone from calm to catastrophic in an instant, and the worst part was that he couldn't explain what had happened. He was supposed to keep the peace, but now he had just become part of the tragedy. He could hear sirens in the distance as more officers arrived, but it was too late to undo the damage. The jogger, a woman who had been running without a care in the world, was now fighting for her life. Davis's mind raced as he realized he had just made a terrible mistake. The woman's identity was still unknown to him, but that wouldn't matter soon. What would matter was how this incident would change everything. And what he didn't know was that this woman was no ordinary jogger. She was someone very important, someone who would make sure this tragedy would not go unnoticed. As the ambulance arrived at the scene, Officer Davis's hands were still shaking. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing with disbelief. The woman lay on the ground, surrounded by police officers, paramedics, and the chaos that followed. Blood stained her clothes, and her once confident demeanor was replaced by fear and pain. Davis could barely speak as paramedics rushed to tend to the woman. He tried to explain what had happened, but his words seemed hollow. His mind was still trying to piece together the events. How had this gone so wrong? Why had Max reacted like this? Davis had never experienced anything like this before in his years of service. The other officers began questioning him, but Davis felt as if he was in a fog. He kept repeating the same words, trying to explain that it had been an accident. Max had never acted this way before. He wasn't sure what had caused the dog to react so aggressively, but all he knew was that he had failed. He had failed the woman, the community, and himself. Meanwhile, the woman was taken to the hospital, her condition critical. Davis had no idea who she was or why she had been jogging in the area, but that didn't seem to matter anymore. All that mattered was the fact that he had injured her, perhaps fatally. He kept replaying the moment in his head, wishing he had done something differently, wishing he had reacted faster. Hours later, the identity of the woman was revealed. Her name was General Grace Williams, a decorated U.S. Army officer with a reputation for leadership and bravery. Davis had no idea who she was when he first saw her. She had been running in civilian clothes, and her uniform hadn't been visible at the time. Now, learning of her identity, Davis realized the gravity of the situation. He hadn't just hurt a random person. He had hurt someone who had served her country with distinction. Davis was consumed by guilt. He couldn't escape the image of General Williams lying on the ground, her life hanging in the balance. The more he learned about her, the more he understood how much of an impact she had made. She had led missions, mentored soldiers, and had earned the respect of her peers. She wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country. Back at the police station, Davis's fellow officers tried to comfort him, but their words didn't help. They could see the guilt in his eyes, and they knew that no matter how much they reassured him, the consequences of what had happened would not be easy to erase. Davis was being called into meetings with higher-ups, and his future with the police department was uncertain. Would he be able to continue working in law enforcement? Could he ever forgive himself for what had happened? As the night wore on, Davis was left to reflect on the events. He was haunted by the thought of what had unfolded. But he also knew that there was more to this story than just a simple accident. The woman he had hurt was not just any person. She had a family, a reputation, and a legacy. And now, as the investigation into the incident would soon reveal, there was more to General Williams than Davis could have ever imagined. What Davis didn't know was that General Williams's family had a far-reaching influence, and her father, a highly respected FBI officer, was about to step into the picture. This was not just going to be any case. It would become a matter of justice, family, and accountability. As the news of General Grace Williams's injury spread, the public's reaction was swift. People were shocked and saddened by the accident, but they were also eager to know more. Many didn't realize the true extent of who General Williams was until the media began revealing her story. She wasn't just any military officer. She was a woman who had broken barriers, led soldiers into battle, and earned countless honors for her bravery and leadership. Davis, still struggling with his guilt, couldn't stop thinking about the woman he had hurt. He had no idea of her significance, and now, as he learned more about her accomplishments, he began to feel even worse. He had not only failed as an officer, but had also caused harm to someone who had dedicated her life to serving others. But as the investigation continued, another shocking detail came to light. General Williams's father was none other than Marcus Williams, a high-ranking FBI officer with decades of experience. Known for his quiet yet powerful presence, Marcus had been a key figure in many important investigations and was highly respected across the country. Now, with his daughter's tragic situation making headlines, Marcus's role in the investigation became inevitable. Marcus Williams was a man who valued justice above all else. When he learned of his daughter's injury, his heart sank. He knew that this wasn't just an ordinary case. His daughter, who had always served with honor and dignity, was now the victim of a horrific accident. The thought of someone hurting her, even if it was unintentional, filled him with anger and confusion. He needed answers, and he would stop at nothing to get them. He immediately got involved in the investigation, using his connections within the FBI to gather information. While his daughter was recovering in the hospital, he took it upon himself to get to the bottom of what had happened. He knew that this incident wasn't just about a K-9 attack. It was about accountability, responsibility, and ensuring that the truth came to light. Meanwhile, Davis felt overwhelmed by the situation. He had been interviewed multiple times, and every word he spoke seemed to make things worse. He had always believed that his K-9, Max, was under control. But now he began to question himself. Had he made a mistake? Had he failed to properly assess the situation? And most importantly, what if the attack wasn't entirely the dog's fault? Days passed, and the investigation revealed more unsettling details. It became clear that the K-9 unit, although generally well-trained, had been involved in previous incidents of aggression that had been swept under the rug. It wasn't just Max. Other dogs in the unit had also shown signs of unpredictability. This revelation made Davis question the department's practices, and he began to wonder if there was a deeper problem with the K-9 program. As for Marcus Williams, his determination to find justice for his daughter only grew stronger. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the investigation was thorough, and he demanded transparency from the police department. He had no tolerance for any cover-ups, especially when it came to his daughter's well-being. The Williams family, strong and resilient, was united in their desire for justice. Marcus knew that this case was going to have a significant impact on not only his daughter's life, but also on the way police forces across the country would handle similar situations. He was determined to make sure that the lessons learned from this tragedy would bring about positive change. Davis, on the other hand, felt conflicted. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he couldn't deny that he had a responsibility to make things right. He wanted to face the consequences of his actions, but he also knew that the journey ahead would be one of redemption and accountability. The truth was slowly emerging, and both Davis and the Williams family were about to learn that there was more to this story than any of them could have imagined. The days that followed the incident were filled with tension. Officer Davis was no longer in charge of his K-9 unit. The police department had suspended him while the investigation was ongoing. He felt like his entire world was crumbling around him. He had never imagined that one wrong decision would lead to such a tragic outcome. He wasn't the only one struggling, though. General Grace Williams's family was devastated by what had happened to her, and they were determined to seek justice for her. As Grace Williams recovered in the hospital, her father, Marcus Williams, spent long hours working with the FBI and local authorities. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and he had made it clear to everyone that he would not let the police department sweep this matter under the rug. He wanted a full investigation into the actions that led to his daughter's injury. Marcus was a man of principle, and the thought of anyone, especially someone in a position of authority, causing harm to his daughter enraged him. But he was also a man who knew how the system worked. He knew that sometimes justice didn't come easily. That's why he made sure to stay involved every step of the way, using his connections within the FBI to ensure that everything was being handled properly. Meanwhile, Davis was struggling with his own guilt. He had never imagined that his dog, Max, would cause harm to someone, especially not someone as important as General Williams. He kept replaying the incident in his mind, wondering if he could have done something differently. Could he have calmed Max down sooner? Could he have avoided the whole situation entirely? The questions weighed heavily on him. Davis had been in law enforcement for years, and he had always prided himself on his ability to handle difficult situations. But now he was faced with a challenge he had never anticipated. The road ahead would be difficult, and he knew that the outcome of the investigation could change his life forever. Still, he was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. As the investigation continued, more information came to light. It was revealed that Max had shown signs of aggression in the past, something that Davis had failed to recognize. The K-9 unit had been involved in several incidents of aggression before, but they had been covered up or dismissed as isolated events. This new information shocked Davis, who had trusted Max with his life. He now realized that there was a bigger problem at play. Marcus Williams continued his fight for justice, demanding accountability from the police department. He knew that this case wasn't just about his daughter. It was about the entire system. He wanted to ensure that something like this would never happen again. But he also wanted to make sure that Davis took responsibility for his actions. Grace Williams, despite her pain, remained strong. She knew that her family was standing behind her, and she appreciated her father's efforts to find justice. However, she also knew that the road ahead would be long. The incident had affected her physically and emotionally, but she was determined to move forward. She wanted to see change, and she wanted to make sure that no one else would have to endure the same pain she had experienced. The investigation was still ongoing, but one thing was clear. The truth was beginning to surface. As more facts were uncovered, Davis began to understand that this wasn't just a simple case of an accident. There were deeper issues at play, and the consequences of this event would ripple through the community for a long time to come. As the days passed, the Williams family remained united, determined to see justice done. Marcus knew that this battle wasn't over, and he would continue to fight until the truth was revealed. Davis, on the other hand, realized that he had to come to terms with his actions and take responsibility for what had happened. Both families were now on a path that would lead them to a resolution, but the outcome was still uncertain. What was clear, however, was that this tragedy would forever change them all. As the investigation continued, the tension in the air was palpable. Officer Davis, once confident in his role, now found himself caught in the midst of a situation he never thought possible. The investigation into the events surrounding the attack on General Grace Williams had not only shaken his career, but it also left him grappling with the moral weight of what had happened. He had never imagined that something as simple as a routine patrol with his K-9 would end in such tragedy. Davis knew that the road to redemption would be long, but he was determined to face the consequences of his actions. The truth had slowly started to unfold, revealing the deeper issue within the K-9 unit. As it turned out, there had been other incidents where dogs had shown signs of aggression, but these were often ignored or swept under the rug. Davis had trusted his K-9 unit for years, but now he realized that not all of them were as reliable as he had believed. While Davis struggled with his own guilt, the Williams family was focused on finding justice. General Grace Williams, although recovering from her injuries, was determined not to let her pain be in vain. She had served her country with honor for years, and now she was facing a new battle, one that would test her strength, both mentally and physically. But Grace wasn't one to back down. She knew that her family, especially her father, Marcus, would not let this issue go unresolved. Marcus Williams, a high-ranking FBI officer, continued to lead the fight for justice. His involvement in the case had made headlines, and the pressure on the police department was growing. As a man who had dedicated his life to justice, Marcus was determined to ensure that the truth was uncovered, no matter where it led. He had always been a figure of authority and respect, but now his role was more personal than ever. This wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about family, honor, and accountability. As the investigation reached its peak, Officer Davis was called to testify. It was a difficult day for him. Standing in front of a room full of people, including the Williams family and other officers, Davis felt the weight of the moment. He had to speak the truth, and he knew that his words would have consequences. It wasn't just about explaining what had happened. It was about acknowledging his mistakes and taking responsibility for them. Davis began by explaining his side of the story, the confusion that had surrounded the incident, and his initial shock when his K-9 unit, Max, reacted the way he did. He admitted that he had failed to properly assess the situation and that his dog's previous behavior should have been taken into account. He explained how he felt betrayed by the system he had trusted and how he was coming to terms with the fact that he had been part of a larger problem. The room was silent as Davis spoke, and for the first time, he felt like he was not just defending his actions, but genuinely seeking redemption. He wanted to make things right, not just for himself, but for Grace Williams and her family. General Grace Williams, who had been listening intently, nodded in understanding. She could see the remorse in Davis's eyes, and though the pain of what had happened was still fresh, she knew that this was the beginning of something important. The truth had come to light, and now, the focus was on ensuring that something like this would never happen again. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued to unfold. For Officer Davis, the path to redemption felt like an endless journey. He knew that no matter what happened, he could never undo the harm caused by that day. But he also realized that he had to keep moving forward. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to learn from this experience and become a better person, a better officer. While Davis faced the consequences of his actions, General Grace Williams was starting to heal, both physically and emotionally. The road to recovery was long, but Grace was resilient. She had always prided herself on her strength, both as a soldier and as a person, and she wasn't about to let this incident define her. She knew that there were bigger battles to fight, not just for herself, but for others who had been hurt by similar situations. The attack had changed her, but it had also sparked a determination in her to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same pain. Marcus Williams, Grace's father, continued to lead the fight for justice. He had worked tirelessly to ensure that the truth was revealed and that the police department would be held accountable. His influence and connections within the FBI had helped push the investigation forward, and he was determined that the changes needed to make the system safer would be implemented. As a father, he couldn't stand the thought of his daughter being harmed. But as an officer of the law, he also knew that the truth needed to be told, no matter how difficult it was. One day, Davis received an unexpected call from Marcus Williams. He was nervous at first, unsure of what to expect. Marcus had always been a strong, authoritative figure, and Davis wasn't sure if this conversation would be an opportunity for forgiveness or a confrontation that would only add to his guilt. To his surprise, Marcus spoke to him calmly and with respect. "I know this has been difficult for you, Davis," Marcus said. "I know that this incident has shaken you. But I also know that you're taking responsibility for what happened. That takes courage." Davis listened quietly. He didn't know what to say, but he was grateful for Marcus's words. He had expected anger, perhaps even resentment, but instead, Marcus had offered understanding. It was a rare gift, and it gave Davis a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," Davis said, his voice trembling. "I just want to make things right. I want to learn from this. I don't want this to happen again." Marcus paused for a moment before responding. "That's what I want too. No one should have to go through what Grace went through. But we both know that real change comes from within. It's not just about the police department. It's about all of us working together to make sure that people are treated with the respect they deserve." Davis nodded, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. He knew that the path to true change wouldn't be easy, but it was a path worth taking. He had to be part of that change, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths and facing the consequences of his actions. As the investigation continued, Davis began to take steps toward reform. He volunteered for additional training in conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and handling high-stress situations with compassion. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that he was better prepared for the future. For General Williams, the healing process was also about moving forward. She worked with her father to raise awareness about the issues surrounding the K-9 program and the need for better training and accountability. They advocated for changes in the system, pushing for reforms that would make future incidents less likely. Grace had always been a fighter, but now her fight was focused on making sure that the justice system served everyone fairly, no matter who they were. As time passed, both Davis and the Williams family realized that the road to healing and change was long, but it was worth it. The impact of the events that had unfolded would not be forgotten, but they had set in motion a journey toward a better future. For Grace, Marcus, and Davis, it was the beginning of a new chapter. one where lessons learned from the past would shape the future, and the commitment to doing what was right would guide them in all that lay ahead. The weeks after the tragic incident were full of challenges, but they also marked the beginning of something more important: change. Officer Davis had started taking the steps necessary to improve, learning from his mistakes and working hard to understand the consequences of his actions. He had made a choice to confront his mistakes and seek a path forward, no matter how difficult it seemed. Davis had enrolled in several training courses to better handle high-stress situations, to learn how to manage his K-9 unit more effectively, and to better understand the psychological impact of police work. Every lesson was a step closer to becoming the kind of officer he had always hoped to be, one who could protect and serve without causing harm. At the same time, General Grace Williams, though still recovering physically, was taking her own steps toward healing. She had always been known for her strength, and despite the immense pain of the attack, Grace remained determined. She knew that her journey to recovery would take time, but it was the change she wanted to see in the world that kept her going. She had always been a fighter, but now her fight was not just for herself. It was for others who had been affected by similar incidents. Grace became a powerful voice for reform. Working alongside her father, Marcus, and other community leaders, she began advocating for better oversight of K-9 programs and police procedures. Her story had reached far beyond the local community, and it had inspired many others to stand up and push for change. One evening, as Grace sat with her father and Davis, they discussed the next steps. They had all been through so much, but they now shared a common goal: to make sure that no one else would suffer the way Grace had. They all knew that change wasn't going to come easily, but they were ready to fight for it. "I think we've come a long way," Grace said quietly, looking at Davis. "We all have a responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen again. The system needs to change, and we can't stop until it does." Davis nodded, his face full of determination. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to make things right. I want to work with you and your father to help make the system better for everyone." Marcus, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "This is how we move forward. It's not just about fixing one mistake. It's about creating a future where everyone can trust the system, where everyone feels safe. That's what we need to focus on." Over the next few months, the trio worked together to push for reforms in the police department. They gathered support from local organizations and community leaders, holding meetings and creating awareness about the issues within the K-9 program and the broader policing system. The support for their cause grew, and more people began to understand the need for change. While the investigation into the incident was still ongoing, Davis was no longer the same man who had made that fateful decision to deploy his K-9. He had learned from his mistakes, and he had become a part of the solution. He knew that there would be no simple fixes, but he was committed to being a better officer, one who understood the power and responsibility that came with his position. For Grace, the path ahead was still filled with uncertainty, but she felt a sense of pride knowing that her fight was making a difference. Every step she took toward recovery was a step toward a better future, not just for her, but for everyone who would come after her. As the months passed, the Williams family and Officer Davis saw their hard work beginning to pay off. The police department had started to implement new training procedures, and discussions about reform became more common. Though the road was still long, they all knew that they were on the right path. And as they looked forward, they understood that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. Months had passed since the tragic incident with the K-9, and although the pain of that day would never fully fade, Officer Davis, General Grace Williams, and her family were beginning to see the fruits of their hard work and determination. They had come a long way, and though the journey had been filled with struggles, it was clear that change was on the horizon. Officer Davis had made significant progress in his personal growth. His training and commitment to becoming a better officer had paid off. He was no longer the man who had made the mistake that had cost Grace so much. He was now someone who took responsibility for his actions, who worked hard to prevent future incidents, and who understood the importance of the trust placed in law enforcement. Davis was slowly rebuilding his life and career, one step at a time. Grace, too, had made strides in her recovery. The physical scars would remain, but the emotional wounds were healing, thanks to the support of her family and the sense of purpose she had found in the fight for justice. She had become a voice for change, using her experience to push for a safer and more accountable system. While the past still haunted her, Grace had channeled her pain into something powerful, something that could create a better future for everyone. Together, with Marcus's guidance, they had begun to see meaningful change in their community. The police department had introduced new policies aimed at improving K-9 training, ensuring that officers were better prepared to handle tense situations without escalating them. There was also an increased focus on transparency and accountability within the department, something that had been lacking before. One afternoon, as Grace and her father sat in their living room, discussing the progress they had made, they received an unexpected visitor, Davis. He had been working on new training methods for K-9 units, and now, with his new understanding of how to handle difficult situations, he wanted to talk to Grace and Marcus about how to continue moving forward. "I wanted to thank you both for everything you've done," Davis began, his voice sincere. "I've learned so much over these months, and I want to continue working with you to make sure that we can keep improving things. It's been a long road, but I feel like we're finally on the right path." Grace looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you've made the effort, Davis," she said softly. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, but seeing the changes you've made means a lot. We all need to work together if we're going to create real change." Marcus nodded in agreement. "It's been a long journey, but we're seeing the beginning of something important. This is just the start, but we're on the right track. I believe that the work we've done will help pave the way for a better future, for the police, for the community, and for everyone involved." Davis felt a sense of pride in hearing their words. He knew that the road ahead was still full of challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had the support of the Williams family, and together, they were making a difference. He was no longer just trying to make up for a past mistake. He was now a part of something much bigger, a movement for change, understanding, and justice. As the conversation continued, the hope in the room grew. What had started as a tragic event had sparked a series of changes that would last for years to come. The community was beginning to see the impact of the new reforms, and although there was still work to be done, the future looked brighter than it had in a long time. For Grace, Marcus, and Davis, the journey was far from over, but they had made an important step in the right direction. They had found strength in each other, and through their shared efforts, they were creating a better world for the next generation. The road ahead would be long, but they knew that together, they could face anything. And with each passing day, they became more and more certain that change, though difficult, was possible. The hope that had once seemed distant was now within reach, and that hope, built on love, justice, and determination, would continue to guide them forward.